In Richmal Crompton's 1928 story The House Behind the Wood, a stranded trio seeks refuge in a seemingly abandoned house. As moonlight bathes the countryside, an eerie atmosphere envelops them. Is the house truly empty, or does it harbour unseen presences? As the night progresses, the characters find themselves grappling with unexpected experiences. What has happened in this house to leave such a strange atmosphere? Join me, Tony Walker, of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, in reading Richmal Crompton's The House Behind the Wood.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back.
The House Behind the Wood by Richmal Crompton. It was after 11 when we discovered that we'd run out of petrol, and of course it was miles away from anywhere. I was motoring with my cousin Frank and his wife. Frank was more like my brother than my cousin. We'd been friends from childhood. "Hike yourself up and see what you can see, Harold," he called to me from where he was tinkering with the engine. I stood on the back seat and surveyed the landscape. Fields and woodland lay around us in the tranquil light of an opal moon. A river shone like burnished silver in the distance. The trees were black shadows in a grey sheen of moonlit fields. "Any signs of a village or a garage?" said Monica anxiously. "'Fraid not," I said, jumping down again. Frank closed the bonnet with a sigh of resignation. "Yes, that's it," he said. "I'd clean forgot I'd used the spare tin. What a darned fool I am." No one contradicted him. Monica drew her wraps about her with a shiver. The night air struck cold, and there was not a breath of wind. "What shall we do?" she said. "Walk to the next village?" Frank shook his head. "If we're where I think we are," he said, "we're about 6 miles from anywhere. I don't want to leave the car for as long as that, for one thing, and for another, you couldn't do it, my dear. Monica is no walker. She is fragile and delicate and runs a high temperature at any overexertion. "We must sleep in the car, I suppose," she said. "Not on your life," said Frank. "I don't want to have you on my hands with pneumonia again." "What can we do then?" said Monica with a little helpless gesture. "Any signs of habitation at all?" said Frank to me. I leapt again onto my point of vantage and gazed round the moon-bathed countryside. "No," I said then. "Wait a sec. I didn't see it before. Funny. Yes, there's a house behind that wood and a light in the window." "Let's try it anyway," said Frank. "They might have some petrol or a bike we could borrow. How do you get to it?" I was still peering into the shadow. "Not sure. Through the wood, I think." "Come along then," said Frank briskly. "Harold and I will go and find out the lie of the land, Monica. You'd better stay here." Again a slight shiver shook Monica's slim form. She looked very, very pale in the moonlight. "Let me come with you," she said. I don't want to be alone. The moonlight's so queer, isn't it?" Frank took a dressing case and cloak in silence, and the three of us set off. A broken gate led into the wood, and a rough winding path through it. It was curiously dank in the wood. Though the road outside had been dry, this path was muddy. The trees seemed to drip moisture. They grew around it thickly. They met overhead. They thrust their undergrowth right up to its edges. "By Jove," muttered Frank, "what a filthy mess. Mind you don't stumble." The wood seemed to end abruptly, and we came out again into the white flood of moonlight. The house stood just in front of us. It was a large house, surrounded by a tangled wilderness of a garden. The house itself wore an air of desolation. It proclaimed itself derelict, untenanted. The moon shone onto dusty, uncurtained windows. It seemed to leer at us evilly with blank eyes. "Hard lines," said Frank. "It's empty." "But I swear I saw a light," I said. "Moonlight on one of the windows," suggested Frank. "No," said Monica in a quick, breathless voice. "Look, there is a light. In a downstairs window. There." We looked and saw the square of glass lit by a faint flickering of golden light, as of fire or a candle. An overgrown bush almost hid it, though I had seen it plainly enough from the road. Knock, said Monica. I went up to the front door and knocked. The sound seemed to echo 10 times magnified through the empty house, then die slowly away. I had a quick uneasy sense of having done something irrevocable, of having roused some dormant power in that sinister sleeping house, for it occurred to me suddenly that there was something sinister about it. The effect might have been caused by the moonlight, or the emptiness, or the dark woodland approach, but there was something sinister about it. I feel like a not-too-brave prince who's rung the bell of an ogre's castle and would like to run away, I said, trying to speak lightly. The other two were listening intently. There was no sound within. "There's no one there," said Frank. "Yes, there is," said Monica. "Listen." We listened. Slow, shuffling steps were approaching the door from inside. It opened, and a little wizened man stood before us. The white moonlight on his face gave him a queer, unearthly look. "I'm awfully sorry to disturb you," said Frank, "but we ran out of petrol. Our car's stranded just outside on the road. I suppose you can't let us have some petrol?" There was a long silence before the man answered. In it I could hear my heart beating. Then he spoke in a high, reedy voice like wind in distant treetops. "No," he said, "I've no petrol." "Can you lend us a bike?" "No." "How far is it to the nearest village?" 6 miles. "Are you the caretaker here?" "Yes." "I suppose you couldn't give us a shakedown for the night?" He hesitated, then, "Yes," he said at last. "I can do that. Come in." I felt an unconquerable reluctance to enter. Alone, I think I should have turned and run back through the dark wood, but Monica and Frank had entered without hesitation, and I followed. The old man led us down a narrow corridor into a room lit by a single candle. The fire on the hearth was a cheering sight after the bitter cold outside. Monica knelt down before it at once, holding out her hands to its blaze. The firelight gleamed on her pale face. The little old man stood in the doorway. The flickering light made his wizened face and grey, wispy hair look more unearthly than ever. "I say, this is fine," said Frank, rubbing his hands cheerfully. The room was furnished with a battered wooden table and a few wooden chairs. The old man spoke from the doorway. "You can have this room for tonight," he said, in his strange, thin voice. "Oh, thanks," said Frank. "That'll be splendid." The eerie effect of it all was gradually disappearing. It was simply an ordinary empty house and an ordinary caretaker, upon which the moonlight had cast a strange, though momentary, effect of terror. Moonlight, of course, can make the most commonplace things take on a look of mystery. "What about food?" went on Frank. "I'm famished." Monica raised her lovely pale face. Her loveliness struck me suddenly then for the first time, with something of a shock. I had known her all my life and accepted her calmly as Frank's wife, and until that moment I had never realized how exquisite she was. I stood staring at her foolishly. She didn't look at me. Her deep blue eyes were fixed on Frank. "There's the hamper," she said. Her voice, clear and silvery, seemed part of the moonlight outside. "Of course," said Frank heartily. "Good egg. We hardly touched the chicken, did we? Harold and I'll fetch it. Might as well get the fur rug, too. We'll leave the others. You stay here and thaw 'em on." "I'll come with you, sir," said the old man from the doorway, and somehow his voice made us all start. "I'll help carry them." "Good man," said Frank. I turned to the doorway, then stood for a minute looking at Monica, who still crouched by the fire, her slim hands outspread, her eyes fixed dreamily on the glowing coals. I could hardly take my eyes off her. The line of her chin and throat was one of blinding beauty. Strange that I had known her all my life, but that until this night of moonlight and magic, her loveliness had passed me unnoticed. I turned from her with a start. The old man was standing in the doorway watching us. I couldn't fathom the look of his eyes. but a shiver ran through me as I met them. "Come along," called Frank from the front door. We stood in the moonlight outside. "The road's here, isn't it?" said Frank, pointing towards the path by which we had come. "It's shorter by this way, sir," said the old man respectfully, leading us across the garden to a smaller and still muddier path through the dark wood. We walked in silence, the old man between us. "Beastly muddy, isn't it?" said Frank at last. "Yes, sir," said the old man in his curiously faint voice. "The wood's always muddy, always. It never gets any air or sun. It's too thick, too thick." We came out onto the main road. Frank took the hamper, the old man the rug, and I a suitcase. We went back by the muddy path through the wood. "It's awfully good of you to let us dump ourselves down like this," said Frank expansively. There was a strange glint in the old man's eye, or was it only the effect of the moonlight? "Not at all, sir," he said, and he might have been speaking from miles away. So faint, so thin, so reedy was his old voice, and in it was just a hint of irony. Monica was still kneeling where we'd left her, her hands outspread to the blaze. She might not have moved or breathed while we'd been away. She turned her head as we entered and looked at me, then at Frank, then back at me. She didn't speak. There was something in her face vaguely puzzled, vaguely frightened. The old man busied himself about the room. He had found a white tablecloth which he spread out over the table. He placed upon it the cold chicken, the wine, the picnic plates, and glasses from our hamper. He had put fresh coals on the fire and pulled close the curtains, shutting out the pallid glare of the moonlight. The room looked almost cheerful. Once I looked at Monica and caught her eyes fixed on me, and a strange electric thrill went through my body. The old man hovered about like a ghost. His dim, glinting eyes flitted furtively from me to Monica, from Monica to Frank. Only Frank was perfectly normal. He drew the ramshackle chairs up to the table with a flourish. "Come along," he cried cheerily. "I'm half starved." Monica moved to the table as in a dream. She let her cloak fall back over her chair, emerging slim and beautiful in her plain grey travelling dress. There was about it a suggestion of the Quaker that accorded well with her pale cheeks and demurely parted hair. "You look cold, my child," said Frank, pouring some wine into her glass. She drained it, but it brought no colour to her cheeks. The strange meal proceeded. Frank ate and drank heartily, discussing cheerfully the details of our motor tour, the ill fortune of our breakdown, the weather, and then, tiring of that, politics. I hardly heard a word he said. A seething excitement possessed me. The realization that I was in love with Monica was being slowly borne in on me, and the knowledge brought me not depression or shame, but a wild exultation. My eyes feasted on her, on the perfect moulding of her cheeks, the satin smoothness of her skin, the sweet curves of her lips. My love was a mad, bacchanalian intoxication. Frank didn't come into the question at all. He simply didn't exist. Only Monica and I existed. Frank's hearty, rubicund countenance and cheerful, resonant voice seemed part of a distant dream. Suddenly Monica looked up and met my eyes again. The blood crept slowly into her pale face. Her eyes only rested on me a second, but in that second I knew that the miracle had happened. She loved me. My heart sang a paean of joy and triumph, for unreasonably I felt that I had already triumphed. Then I saw the old man watching us, his glinting eyes flitting from me to Monica, from Monica to the unaware Frank, and his eyes sent a cold thrill of terror and apprehension through my joy. They held a sinister weight of knowledge. He had crept silently into the room without our noticing him. He had found some apples and bananas in our hamper and had arranged them on one of our cardboard plates. He placed it silently on the table and withdrew. "Decent old chap, the caretaker," said Frank, and added with his booming laugh, "Knows we'll make it worth his while, of course." He stood in front of the fire and looked round the room. "Well, we can shake down here all right," he said. "We shall be warm, even if we don't sleep." Again, like a shadow, the old man appeared suddenly in the room. "There's another room," said the thin, faint voice, "just next to this. I've lit another fire in it, and if the young gentleman—" He looked at me. "Right," I said. "I'll go there, Frank. Good night." "Good morning," said Frank with a laugh. A distant church clock had just struck 1. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds looking at Monica. Her gaze met mine, straight, unfaltering. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. Her look was an assurance of love as sudden, as passionate as mine. It held something else too, some warning, some guarded promise. The other room was smaller than the one I had left. It contained 3 derelict chairs and an old rug. A log fire crackled in the old wide grate. I had never in all my life felt less like sleep. I felt as a man might feel who, turning over the soil of his garden, has come across a gold mine. I had found treasure, treasure immeasurable. I loved Monica, and she loved me in return. I paced the room, my heart beating tumultuously. I could have leaped and yelled and challenged the whole world. She loved me. She loved me. My whole being chanted it. I stopped in my walk and, throwing back my head, laughed aloud as the memory of Frank's red face and booming voice came to me. I imagined myself killing Frank, fastening my fingers round his throat and slowly squeezing his life out. I longed to do it. It would be so easy. So easy. At last, I felt suddenly weary, and making my coat into a pillow, I lay down in front of the fire. I don't know how long I slept, but I awakened with the distinct impression that someone had knocked softly upon my door. I rose hastily and slipped on my coat. Immediately upon waking, the strange excitement I had been conscious of earlier in the evening returned to me. My love for Monica seemed to fill the world. She loved me. She was mine. She was mine. She loved me. My heart pounding in my ears, I opened the door very softly. I could dimly make out the figure of the old man in the shadow of the staircase. His whisper was no louder than a faint sigh. "She's in the garden, waiting for you, sir." I must be honest, I cannot swear to have actually seen the old man then, or heard his voice, but I was conscious of him, and certainly something said those words to my heart. "She's in the garden waiting for you, sir." I hurried out into the garden, running, panting, my heart aflame. She was there, in the moonlight, just outside the house. Her pale cloak was drawn about her. Her cheeks were softly flushed, her eyes bright. "Come," she whispered urgently, "quickly, quickly, before he wakes and finds out." I knew at once what she meant. She was leaving Frank. She was coming away with me. Perhaps by some magic she and the old man had got petrol for the car. I didn't stay to ask. I seized her hand, and together we ran down the path through the wood, the longer path by which we had first come from the road. I couldn't waste time trying to find the other. We ran, stumbling over the undergrowth, dodging trees. Sometimes we ran hand in hand. Sometimes I went in front to hold back the bushes for her. Then I heard an angry shout behind me. It was Frank's great voice, upraised terribly. I heard a crashing through the woods behind me. "Run to the road," I said breathlessly to Monica. "I'll follow you." She ran on fleetly through the thick shadow of the trees. I turned to face Frank. I remember that I was smiling. I felt a wild, exultant joy. Here was the chance I had longed for all night, the chance to put my fingers round Frank's thick red neck and slowly squeeze the life out of him. He came suddenly into sight. His face was distorted with fury. He had a stout stick in his hand. He came up to me and stopped. For a second I crouched, ready to spring. He had his stick swung back. My hands were ready. Then, before either of us moved, came a cackling, diabolical laugh from the direction of the house, followed, before it died away, by a low moan from the road. Frank dropped his stick, and together we turned and ran towards the car. Monica lay fainting, half in, half out of the car. This wasn't really as serious as it sounds. Monica had a weak heart and fainted not infrequently at any extra exertion or excitement. She recovered soon after we had arrived, sat up, and looked about her in bewilderment. "I'm so tired," she said at last, in a little, far-away voice. "Come back to the house. It's cold for you out here," said Frank tenderly. He seemed to have forgotten everything in his concern for her. She shrank back, terrified. "Oh, no," she said. "No, no, no." Without a word, he tucked her up on the back seat in the old rugs we had left in the car, and almost immediately she fell asleep. I watched them both in silence. It was Frank, my oldest friend, whom I loved more than anyone else in the whole world. It was Monica, the sweet but rather colourless girl I'd always known, but never loved, whose highest quality in my eyes was that she made Frank happy. I felt as if I had just awakened out of a sinister dream. Frank came over to me. "I say, old chap," he said sheepishly, "I'm awfully sorry. You must have thought me mad. That old chap came to my room and said—" He passed his hand over his brow. "Blessed if I haven't forgotten what he said, but it sent me raving mad. I don't know whether the old chap really came or not, now I come to think of it. I suspect the whole thing was part of a beastly nightmare." He nodded towards his sleeping wife. "I suppose she was walking in her sleep again, and you saw her. Awfully good of you, old chap. I do sleep like the dead. If that old chap hadn't— Or was it all a nightmare?" Dawn was already breaking, a warm golden dawn, putting to flight the silver magic of the moonlight. We walked in silence to the end of the road and back. "Someone ought to come along soon," said Frank hopefully. "I want to get away from this place. Unhealthy, that's what it is. An old house, you know. Drains. I've never gone in for nightmares of that sort before." A boy on a bicycle passed singing, took a kindly interest in our predicament, and departed with an SOS to the nearest garage. Then Monica awoke with a start. She pushed her disordered hair out of her eyes and looked around her. "What's happened?" she said. Frank laughed. "We all spent the night having nightmares," he said, "and you walked in your sleep, and then you scared us stiff by fainting." He laughed again. "I think the chicken must have been a bit high last night." She gazed into the distance, and some faint memory brought the colour to her cheeks. "Did I walk in my sleep?" she said slowly. "I had a perfectly horrid dream." The petrol arrived soon after that, and Frank's spirits rose to their normal high level, but I think he funked returning to the house as much as any of us. "Look here," he said, "we're all starving. Let's go to the next village and feed first, and then come back and collect the things and tip the old codger." There was an old inn on the outskirts of the village, and a homely innkeeper's wife promised us breakfast in half an hour's time. Frank and Monica went upstairs. I went into the dining room. A rosy-cheeked waitress was just coming out. The innkeeper's wife followed me. "Will this table do, sir?" "Yes," I said then. "Do you know the house behind the wood, about 6 miles down the road?" She threw a quick glance at me. "Yes," she said, and shut her lips tightly. "Do you know the caretaker?" I went on. "There is no caretaker," she said shortly. "Hasn't been for over a year." "Do you mean the house is left without a caretaker?" I said rather foolishly. "Yes," she said, and added meaningly, "It's not a house as even tramps would care to spend the night in. You can't get any of the folks in this village to go near it after dark." The rosy-cheeked waitress entered with a tray. "Nessie here used to be maid there, and she wouldn't go near it after dark, I'd be bound." She went out. The girl began to lay the table. "You used to be a maid at the house behind the wood," I began. Somehow I felt desperately anxious to solve the mystery. She threw me a quick, guarded glance, rather like the glance with which the woman had met my reference to the place. "Aye, sir," she said, "in Mr. and Mrs. Tramott's time, before—" She stopped. "Before it happened?" I supplied very quietly and at a venture. I was rewarded by her start of surprise. "You know something about it then, sir," she said. "Not much," I said, and again I made a venture. "She was in love with someone else, wasn't she?" "Yes, sir, with Mr. Tramott's cousin, with young Mr. Moxton, an old Sainton, the butler, him that was afterwards a caretaker. She stopped short, as if unwilling to continue. "Tell me what happened exactly," I said, persuasively. "Well," she said, with a curious mixture of reluctance and eagerness, "it was this way, sir. Old Sainton acted as a kind of go-between between Mrs. Trammett and young Mr. Moxton, though I believe he hated young Mr. Moxton all the time. He took notes and told Mr. Trammett lies to put him off the scent and such like. Then, one night," she shuddered, hesitated a minute, then plunged on, "they were to have eloped, sir. Old Sainton arranged it all, told him she was ready and all that, and then, as soon as they'd started, before they got through the wood, he woke Mr. Trammett and told him." "Why did he do that?" I put in quickly. She shrugged her shoulders. "He disliked Mr. Moxton, sir, I suppose, or perhaps they didn't give him as much money as he'd hoped for. Anyway, Mr. Trammett went after them." "With a stick?" I said breathlessly. "How do you know, sir?" "Oh, the papers, I suppose. Yes, and they fought there in the wood, and Mr. Moxton tried to throttle him," I said. "Did throttle him, sir, but not before Mr. Trammett had given him such a smash with a stick that he died before his trial came off even." "So they were both killed?" "Yes, sir." "And the lady?" "It killed her, sir, too. She never recovered from the shock. She died before the year was out. It's funny you should ask me today, sir, because it was last night, 5 years ago, it happened, and I was just thinking about it when you came in." "What happened to the old man?" I said. "He stayed on as caretaker, sir, till last year, then died in a kind of fit." I went cold. "Died?" I said blankly. But just then Monica and Frank came in, and Frank began to talk about the weather. They seemed, I noticed, more in love with each other than ever. Monica avoided my eyes. The horror of her dream still lay upon her. Directly after breakfast, Frank and I motored back to collect the rugs and, as Frank had put it, tip the old codger. The house looked almost as eerie in the daylight as it had looked in the moonlight. The surrounding wood, the untended garden, dirty, discoloured windows, the whole air of dreary desolation made me shudder afresh. We found the rooms just as we had left them. The hamper, the motor rug, the burnt-out ashes in the grates, the remains of our supper on the table. "Now for finding the caretaker," said Frank, picking up rug and hamper. "Frank," I said slowly, "they told me at the inn that there was no caretaker here." "What?" said Frank blankly. Then he laughed. "I see, some tramp pinching a night's lodging and bluffing it out. Well, I suppose we'd no more right here than he had. Let's rout him out. He's sure to be hanging around waiting for a tip." But he wasn't. We searched the house from top to bottom, and he wasn't there. There were no signs of habitation in the house except in the rooms we had occupied. "Scared off probably by someone," pronounced Frank, "or he would have taken the rug. I say, you know, there is something unhealthy about this house. Do you feel it?" "Yes," I said. We went out into the tangled garden carrying the rug and basket. "Let me see," said Frank. "Which was the short path he showed us?" We found it at last, the opening half hidden by a large laurel. I remembered it once we were upon it. Narrow, muddy, and tortuous. Then halfway down it Frank stopped. The blood had slowly drained away from his face. "Good heavens," he said. "Look." He was pointing at the path before us. Suddenly I saw what he meant. It was the path by which the three of us, Frank and I and the old man, had gone to our car and returned the night before. At each side, where Frank and I had walked, were our footmarks, going and coming. In the middle, where the old man had walked, there was no footprint at all. You might be one of those people like me who doesn't like the stories to be interrupted with ads. And this podcast has ads on it. However, there is a solution. If you would like access to the stories without ads and a link to a library of all the stories I've ever done that you can download without ads, you can get that by becoming a patron. So if you join for $5 or the equivalent in your currency a month, you can have all the stories ad-free. So consider becoming a patron. Go to www.patreon.com
Patreon, patreon.com/Barcud, BARCUD.
So that was The House Behind the Wood, published in 1928. Published. Don't know when it was written. It was collected in 1928. It was by Richmal Crompton, who was born 1890, died 1869. So as normal, I'm going to say something about the author, and I'm going to say something about the story, and then I'm going to say something about various ideas that occur to me while we're talking about the story and the author, and perhaps some that have got nothing to do with those either. So anyway, Richmal Crompton Lamburn, better known as Richmal Crompton, was born in 1819 in Bury, Lancashire. She was the second, or Bury, she was the second child, I don't think I've done that right, of Reverend Edward John Sewell Lamburn, a classics master at Bury Grammar School, and his wife Clara, born, or née, Crompton. Somebody produced, I'd on the Detective Channel got somebody to do narration for me, and they pronounced nay as knee, yeah, and oh goodness me, there were some comments about that. So I will do it correctly. Née Crompton was born as Crompton's early education took place at St Elphin's boarding school for the daughters of the clergy, although her dad he's a teacher, but he was also in holy orders as well. So it was initially in Warrington in Cheshire and later moved to Darley-Dale in Derbyshire. Her academic prowess was evident from a young age, culminating in her winning a scholarship to Royal Holloway College, University of London. In 1914, she graduated with a BA Honours degree in classics, and she went back to St Elphin's School as classics mistress like her dad. In 1917, at the age of 27, she moved to Bromley High School in southeast London, where she quickly gained a reputation as a talented and beloved teacher. Now, during her teaching career, she began to write the William Brown stories. The most famous, of course, is Just William, published in 1922. So she died in 69, and I was born in 61. So I devoured the William stories. I just went through them. They were so funny. I loved them to bits, I didn't know of her as a ghost story writer. 1923, she contracted polio, which left her without the use of her right leg, and she gave up teaching at this point and became a full-time writer. But, her literary career flourished. Now, it's an interesting thing. Does your success come before you give up your day job? I read an article about Kath Kidston, Kidston, who was a renowned British designer known for her vintage-inspired home and fashion accessories. She was saying that she went all in, and it was then that her business flourished, not before. So she didn't wait till it flourished. She kind of had faith in herself, which is scary. We know that. It's scary. But anyway, I mean, I'm not saying it's a great thing to have polio and lose the use of your leg. I'm not saying that at all. But who knows what fate has in store for us. So William was the mainstay of her career. 38 books between 1922 and 1970. The William Browning's Outlaws, they were fantastic, I loved them. But she wrote 40 novels for adults, for which she's not really remembered, and several other children's books. Her novels, obviously, adult novels considered more serious works, the things that preoccupy people who write, family dynamics, social constraints, and the changing face of English society. Plenty of people have written about that. So she never married and had no children, although she was an aunt and a great aunt. Some people say they think I'm saying ant, as in the, and I do pronounce it exactly the same. The ant, the crawly animal, the crawly little insect, and I'm thinking if I've got any blood ants. Yeah, I had my Aunt Agnes, my Aunt Marjorie, who I never met. I don't think you know them. So I won't talk about them too much. Yeah, I would have called them aunt. Anyway, she had a house built in Bromley Common, on Bromley Common, for herself and her mother. And during the Second World War, she joined the Auxiliary Fire Service. In her later years, interestingly for the subject of this story, she developed an interest in reincarnation, mysticism, and the occult. But of course, she'd already published this story, this collection of ghost stories, in 1928. So I think she probably had an embryonic interest in this kind of thing that we're interested in. Early on, she was a conservative politically and a regular church goer, so she wasn't as outrée as to leave the Church of England. She died in 1969 at the age of 78 after having a heart attack in Farnborough Hospital. Now, Farnborough, Kent, I'm guessing, rather than Farnborough, Hampshire. This used to be a terrible thing. When I was, not terrible, I mean, these are... I'm exaggerating a little bit. When I was a young man, I was living in London. My girlfriend at the time lived near Farnborough in Hampshire. I lived at Yateley, actually. And I used to go down and see her, and I used to say to people, I'm going to Farnborough. And they immediately thought it was Farnborough, Kent. But it's not. It was Farnborough, Hampshire. Anyway, there we are. So her last book, William the Lawless, was published posthumously. So that doesn't say much about her ghost stories, but I'm going to tell you about those. So The House Behind the Wood is one of 13 stories featured in Richmal Crompton's collection Mist and Other Ghost Stories. It was originally published in 1928. But the story, along with the rest of the collection, remained out of print for many decades until it was reissued in 2015. I have a Kindle version of it. This was edited by Richard Dolby, who was a very prolific and influential editor of ghost stories, and his wife was as well, Mary Dolby. And he had anthologized Rosalind, which is the other story I've done by her, in the Virago Book of Ghost Stories, I think. And that's where I came across her in that story. I thought it was really good. I've done it on the podcast, and so I did this one. It was an interesting story in terms of its structure and form and content. Not groundbreaking, but I tell you what, I thought she did really well. I mean, she doesn't need me to tell her that, but I really enjoyed reading it. And when I'm actually reading a story, I'll have kind of little mental conversations with the author, and I'll be saying in my mind, what do you think about that? Is that how you want it? How do you think it's going? And quite often, and Richmal was thinking it was all right, actually. So I'm pleased for that ghostly support there. And so, yeah, so the structure of it, the car breaks down. So you might think that is the first rather coincidental thing. Oh yeah, on the anniversary of this murder, this replication of the love triangle that happened, I've forgotten now, 5 years previously, on that very night. That's convenient. So why did it break down? Well, I want to tell you, why do cars break down when UFOs are near? Eh? Yeah, answer me that one. They all do. The electrics go, they have time slips, they have all sorts of stuff. So, but seriously though, I was being serious before as well, it is fate, isn't it? It's fate. I think fate is a really important theme to this story. And we do see this time and time again, how literature uses this idea of fate to replay historical events, and people are forced to replay things that happened in the past. It's not I did a story like this called The Haunting of Tullabeg Castle, which I think is out of print. But yeah, that was about the same idea. That was a very similar. It was a love triangle, which I don't know. This isn't why I picked this story, but it was based on the Irish legend of Diarmid and Grania and Finn McCool. There we are. So, and also, it's another version of the story of this love triangle issue of Tristan and Iseult, or Iseult if you prefer, or Isolde if you want to go German. But you know what I mean. That one there, and Wagner made a thing about that as well, of course. But it's originally potentially a Cornish story, or even I've heard it was a Pictish story. One theory that it was originally Pictish because the name Dristan is a Pictish name, appears in the Pictish king lists. So maybe it was a Pictish story that travelled its way south and eventually ended up under the eye and control of Richard Wagner. So Anyway, so this idea of the love triangle. Now, there are a couple of stories that have come to my mind that we've done is The Black Widow by John Glasby, and also, this is me remembering, The Horned God, which was a kind of one I did about Pan and the influence of sort of a pagan-y one, really. If you look back, you'll find it. So I want to say a couple of things about the first thing, the theme, if you like, is the idea of the house, a house being an emotional manipulator. So it isn't completely clear cut because it's not just the house, is it? It's the ghost of the caretaker, and of course So I was saying what I thought she did well. So I'm dancing around a bit today, more than usual. The coincidence of the car, yeah, I forgive that. I think it actually adds weight to it isn't just a coincidence, it's a fated incident, so that adds weight to the story rather than detracting from it, in my opinion. If it was just a kind of a convenient coincidence that the author had manipulated, you might think, oh well, it's just a bit cheap, that, really. But I think the fact that it happens in this house on this anniversary adds to the fated nature of the love triangle. And we feel that these are the love triangles that we've talked about when we hear the stories of Tristan and Isolde and Dermot and Grania, which is probably the same story, really. It does feel fated, It's like we struggle to escape our fate, which is a really interesting idea. I have discussions with Sheila in our house, which can get quite heated, and they're about nature versus nurture. And I am actually a bit of a determinist. I'm not a fully fledged determinist in that I keep the door open to the idea that we may have free will. But when I look around, and the key idea for me, and I'm a bit of a fan of Arthur Schopenhauer's will, this blind striving will, which is related to Indian ideas about karma and things like that. But anyway, so when I look, and I think this is the case here, when we fall passionately in love with somebody, we don't choose it. No, and with many of these deep emotions that we have, love towards place, the country we live in, the landscape, the people that we know, our parents, our dogs, love, also hate in some cases. I'm not much of a hater, really. I haven't got really passionate. I don't like traffic wardens, I must admit. That is probably my irrational hate. I'm sorry if you're a traffic warden, but you need to get another job. Yeah, but all these long-lasting emotions, we don't choose them. And so and if you look at addiction as well, why drink a bottle of vodka a day? People I've worked with alcoholics, and people who they don't want to do it. They don't, when you're addicted to something, you don't really want to do it, but you're compelled to do it. So who is doing the choosing here? So, but when I say I leave the door open a little bit, I have, as a human being, to be able to feel that we can do something about our situation, because otherwise, if it's all fated and we've got no room for maneuver. This is Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return. He had this idea that we are fated to return and live the life exactly as we do. We don't remember it, which is glorious, because if we did, that would be torture. But we just do exactly the same thing, make exactly the same mistakes, and exactly the same lucky breaks, I suppose. But his idea, and I'm not sure I buy that, really. But so I'm mainly determinist. I like to think we have a bit of free will. But I struggle to square that circle. And I suppose one of my guys that I listen to and follow is a philosopher, Dutch philosopher. He's mixed nationality, I suppose. Bernardo Kastrup, and you may have heard me talk about him before. And he talks about, I don't think he does believe in free will. He says things are either determined or they're random. And so in neither of those cases can there be free will. I'm going to give it mystical on you, but I do. And that is to say, I say respectfully to Bernardo, I think there's a possibility of a third option. So things may be completely random. They talk about quantum decay and stuff like that being completely random, or they may be completely determined in that everything has a cause, and so if nothing is not caused, except if it's random. And the third one I would like to say is divine creation. Oh yeah, cards on the table. I believe there is a divine spark of creation, and I think that we as images of that divine spark partake in that creation. So I would say that I think that we have a possibility to create as well. But, when I write a story, or when a musician makes music, or a dancer dances, or whatever kind of art there is, or a builder builds, where, particularly with the artistic stuff, where's it coming from? I don't know. So in what sense can I claim credit for that? But I think there is a creativity at work, but it isn't necessarily mine. It's working through me, or through whoever, through Richmal Crompton. Anyway, we have kind of gone a little way, but I think it's all grist to the mill. I was wanting to talk about the tradition of stories of haunted houses as emotional manipulators, because, and I keep saying I was going to say what she does really well, and I get distracted from myself. But I think what she does well is that approach to the wood. The first approach through the wood, when they see this house in the moonlight, I think is magnificent for its tension. I think she does a really good job of creeping us out. Oh no, and that apprehension, and then this figure. And what I was going to say was, initially I thought it's the fairies. Particularly, and it has something feel of a fairy story around it. They eat, and the feast is laid out for them, because of course the only difference is that it's not the fairy feast. Now, you mustn't eat fairy food. Look at Tolkien's The Hobbit. They're tempted in Mirkwood with the spiders by the elf feasts, and that's very much fairy lore. Tolkien was very keen on fairies. I was reading an early some stuff about his early obsession with fairies, an article about that. Anyway, so I thought, yeah, fairies, and then of course, are fairies and ghosts similar? They belong to the same realm, I suppose. Argue about that if you want. Maybe there are different realms. I don't know. I'm not an expert geographer in supernatural realms, but then clearly it is a ghost story, because this is the caretaker. Now, the caretaker seems malevolent, like a fairy, because the fairies, the good folk, we only call them that because we don't want them coming and giving us a hard time. They're mischievous. They seem to just do bad things because they enjoy it. They're trickster figures. And so why did this, if we go back to, I've forgotten, Mr. Moxton. No, Mr. Moxton was the one who got battered. I can't remember the name of the caretaker. You've just heard it. I haven't. I did that yesterday. And so why does he set up this love triangle? Why does he facilitate this? He just, because he hates everybody potentially, and he wants it all to go wrong, and they all die. But of course, in our echo of this story, they don't die. They get off with it, and they're just replaying it as if they are actors in a play. It's not the real incident which happened 5 years ago, which led to death of everybody, but it is orchestrated by the ghost, so not the real caretaker. So it's a little more bloodless, isn't it? A little less real than the original, because the original was very physical and ended in the death of everybody involved, ultimately the caretaker as well. Although his death wasn't caused, Anyway, so this idea of a house, although it's the caretaker, influencing emotions and making people feel things that aren't theirs. So this is why I was talking about emotions grabbing us and possessing us. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a while as well. In many stories, it's a house. I'm thinking of John Buchan's Full Circle, which we've done on the podcast, whereby Sir Edward Leithen in that house has the memories and emotions of a previous occupant. We get these two modern socialist people coming, and they are turned by the house into amiable hunting, shooting, fishing country folk. By the benign power of the house, the oldness of the house, which habituates them to conservative values, I suppose, if we're talking about the conservative values of the countryside being inherently conservative, which I think they are. I mean, I think in interesting things like folk stories and folk music is an inherently conservative thing. Being interested in the land strikes me in the same way, Anyway, that's another subject for spluttering over your coffee. So, other stories of malevolence, just to mention them, of houses which influence the psychology of the people. Of course, Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. Done that on the podcast. Go and listen to it. 1959. We know that. It's worth a listen. Great story. Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. Done that on the podcast. Go and listen to it. Again, and this is, of course, Henry James's story, 1898, is the time when the psychological becomes a big deal in ghost stories, and we're never quite sure whether this Henry is the master. This is the master story of this. Whether the governess is in fact seeing things or it's true. And then we have, of course, much earlier, well, I say earlier, 50 years earlier, we have Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, 1839, done on the podcast. Go and listen to it. And the house itself, in this case, not so much influences the mental state of the ushers, who are batshit crazy, but is a mirror potentially, or they are one, aren't they? The family grow out of like the house grows out of the rock, the family grow out of the house. So it's not necessarily the same. It's true to say that the house influences them. They are of a piece with the house. Then, of course, Stephen King's The Shining, not done on the podcast. Came out in 1977, where the Overlook Hotel gradually, because it's full of ghosts, isn't it, influences Jack Torrance's thoughts and behaviour, exacerbates pre-existing mental instabilities and alcoholism, yeah. And then we have Richard Matheson's Hell House, which is a great book. I thought about doing that for the podcast, but it's got boobies in it, so we can't have stories with boobies on the podcast. Can't be happening. So, but that definitely, the Hell House is a very evil, wicked house. If you don't know that story, I would go. It's one of those classics, I think, of the 70s, like The Shining, of course, and Stephen King stuff, but also Peter Straub's Ghost Story. One of those classic 70s, I guess The Exorcist as well, horror ghost story books. Anyway, so we see this, the house casts a spell of love on them, doesn't it? So that leads me to talk again about stone tape theory. I know I talk about this a bit, so just for those who don't listen to me all the time, stone tape theory, okay? So this theory posits that intense emotional or traumatic events can be recorded by the physical environment, particularly by stone or other building materials, and then played back under certain conditions affecting sensitive individuals who encounter the space. It seems to me that this is a scientism version of it. It's like what happened during the, we've become very rationalistic and scientific, and the scientific method is fantastic. And we tend to see everything through the scientific method, but the scientific method is linked, not necessarily, but is in fact linked with materialism and physicalism. So that says that there is only this. I've just tapped the table. There is only this. Anything else doesn't exist. And so that means if you do have apparently supernatural things, you need to explain them in this materialist worldview through physical processes. So you end up with a quasi-science. And this is what it is. There is no real scientific basis to any of this. I don't think there was some quasi story about mica crystals in sandstone, because they're crystals and because you can record, and they vibrate and they can work as some kind of magnetic recording. But I think that's all very weak, to be honest. I think it's trying to make sense of the supernatural within the physicalist paradigm. Because stone tape theory gets its name from 1972, Nigel Neal, the stone tape play. Fantastic, really. I'd love to produce that, actually. If we take stone tape theory, is it because this happened in the house that it is influencing them? Yeah. The power of place, though, is really important. This idea is really important. It's almost like I often wonder. I used to think when I was younger, and I used to go on ghost tours and stuff, we go to haunted places, or stone circles, or megalithic tombs and all that kind of stuff, or old castles, and it'd be like some of these would have a history of people seeing things and having experiences. And I always wondered, and I've not come to any conclusion, whether it was the place that was haunted, or was it us, we who took our expectations and predilections and pre-existing kind of tendencies there? Or is it feng shui? Is it kind of earth energy? And of course, there's a fantastic thing called the Dragon Project. Again, I've written something about this in the 70s. I went around and measured all the different stone circles and measured with Geiger counters for radiation, for acoustics, sub and ultrasonics, heat, geomagnetic aberrations. They measured all of these things. They came up with some interesting stuff. But that's a stone tape idea. If you want to know more about the stone tape theory, of course, watch the Stone Tape by Nigel Neal, which is probably available on YouTube. But also, just for a bit of background, the idea was first created by an archaeologist called Thomas Charles Lethbridge, born 1901, died 1971. And he came up with the core ideas of this in the 1960s. And it was he who proposed that emotional or traumatic events could be recorded in stones and other materials. So you want to look out for his books, Ghost and Ghoul, 1961, and Ghost and Divining Rod, 1963. They're probably really expensive and hard to get hold of. But I thought it was worth just talking about the stone tape. I mean, why was it worth talking about the stone tape? Because we're trying to explain. It's really interesting. We are taking this story as if it were real, and trying to explain the experiences of fictional characters as if they were real by saying, "Oh, it's the stone tape theory. It's stone tape. That's what's happening to them." And of course, they're not real, and we don't have to explain it. We can just accept it as being what happens in the story for the sake of the story, which is a good story. Anyway, I did some years ago some philosophy courses, and I remember doing one on the philosophy of emotions. It was part of a philosophy of mind course, so some of the Greek ideas about emotions are really interesting, particularly the very early stuff, because Greek thinking about the emotions changes, and we get the Stoics have their views about emotions later on, and we have this idea of the daemons, which are your own personal spirit, not necessarily a bad guy who gives you advice. And apparently Socrates would talk to his, and it was the daemon that talked him into drinking the hemlock at the end, even though he was minded to leg it and not get killed. But the daemon said, "No, you've got to drink it." So he did, because he always did what his daemon told him. But jumping back several centuries into the dawn of classical thinking, we come to Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad. Now he portrays his characters, and we've got to remember that this is fiction. It's an epic poem. It was recited rather than written for centuries before it was kind of in the form that we know it. And of course, academics get involved in this, and they'll say, "Oh no, it wasn't," So they just have lots of arguments about stuff, because that's what they do for a living. But we normal people can actually step back a bit and be a bit more sensible. So we see in Book 1 of the Iliad, the goddess Athena physically restrains Achilles from striking Agamemnon. This is a kind of is it a metaphor? Or did they think the goddess really stood behind him? It's hard to know. I think that the view was that the goddess really was present and restrained, and that is, so his emotion and his actions are directly influenced by the gods, like an interference or a possession in some cases. And when we think about love, which is in this story, we talk about Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and she has the power to inspire overwhelming desire. So in the Iliad, she fills Helen with longing for Paris, distracting both from battle. Euripides, Hippolytus demonstrates Aphrodite's ability to induce destructive passion, like this, really, as she causes Phaedra to fall madly in love with her stepson. Similarly, in Apollonius' Argonautica, Aphrodite's son Eros makes Medea fall in love with Jason, leading to disastrous consequences. And it's not just love. We have the god of war,
Ares, and he's less explicitly shown causing anger, but he embodies the violent and angry aspects of war. In the Iliad, he's described as manslaughtering, blood-stained, and quarrelsome. So the central rage or wrath, so menis in ancient Greek, in Achilles of the Iliad, could be seen as Ares in influence, although it isn't. Homer doesn't say that directly. But then, of course, we get Plato later on, and he talks about daemones, and these spiritual beings, often described as intermediaries between gods and humans, could influence thoughts and feelings. And so in the Symposium by Platon in Welsh, represents, and I remember learned about Plato in Welsh, you see, so that's really interesting, because some of the things, like I learned about phonology, Seineg, in Welsh, so the Welsh words come first to me, because that's when I first learned them anyway. So as mediators between gods and mortals, or eros, love. So they have this idea of the daemones. The next thing I just want to jump into, related to this idea of supernatural beings causing us to be possessed by emotions, is of course Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, where we have Puck under Oberon's orders, King of the Fairies. So I'm connecting this with my original thought that this was a fairy incident, uses a magical flower to manipulate love. So we see this is similar to how Aphrodite and Eros inspired desires. And so we have, so the love is, Puck is comic, isn't it? The love, and it's a comic device, but it leads to chaos, confusion, and conflict. But of course, it's different. Puck as a fairy or sprite is more like the daemones than to major Olympian gods. I mean, I think that's a small difference, really. But, and it may be, the content, the notes I've got suggest that Shakespeare's use of these themes reflects Renaissance interpretations of classical ideas filtered through the lens of medieval European fairy lore. Maybe, but I like to think that it might not be classical ideas at all. This might just come from fairy lore, that the idea is that the fairies are mischief makers, that they can cause trouble. And as we see in The House Behind the Wood, they can make Bottom fall in love with a donkey. They can make our narrator see colourless Monica as being the most passionately beautiful woman. And we've all had that, haven't we? Well, maybe you haven't, but many of you will recognise that feeling of being passionately obsessed with another human being romantically, and that later on, when that has passed, and it may last for years, you meet this person or you see this person and you think, what on earth was I thinking? And the scales fall from your eyes, and you see this person as just an ordinary person, not the god or goddess that you believed they were. So, yeah, I really like the story. I would give it a 9 out of 10. I don't know what you think. I like fairy stories, and this, even though it's a ghost story and a haunted house story, it's kind of also a fairy story to me, with the caretaker playing the role of Shakespeare's Puck. There we are. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you're all well, and I'll be back soon. I should just add that somebody complained that there's no end music anymore, and I'll tell you why I stopped the end music, because somebody complained it waked them up. So you can't win, can you? So for now, I won't have any end music, although if you have a view on it, I can maybe do a poll. I think I will do a poll.